Imagine for a moment that you were asked to design the perfect leader. The kind you would trust with a nation in crisis, a company on the edge of collapse, or an army standing at the brink of battle. You would probably ask for someone who remains calm under pressure, who never hesitates when difficult decisions must be made, who speaks with absolute confidence, even when everyone else is uncertain, who can persuade strangers, command attention, and walk into conflict without fear. None of these qualities sound particularly dangerous. In fact, history has rewarded them with promotions, elections, fortunes, and sometimes entire nations. Now imagine that many of those same qualities also appear in a different context on one of the most researched clinical checklists in psychology. This is the uncomfortable possibility that almost nobody talks about, not because psychopaths secretly rule the world, nor because every successful person is one of them. Both of those ideas are far too simple. The real question is quieter and therefore much more interesting. What if the modern world occasionally rewards the very traits it claims to fear? What if, without ever intending to, we have built institutions that select for them? This is a documentary not about monsters hiding in dark alleys. It is about ordinary offices, boardrooms, operating theaters, campaign stages, and every place where power quietly gathers. Because if there are snakes in suits, the remarkable thing is not that they exist. The remarkable thing is how often we mistake them for natural leaders. We are all familiar with this pop culture image of the psychopath and psychopathy inspired by the media and cinema, where a psychopath feels less like human and more like an ethereal piece of evil, descended not from primates but from devils. What he does is by definition unimaginable to us. This is the Hannibal Lecter savoring a meal that should have made him human and didn't. The Norman Bates wearing his mother's voice like a second skin. The Joker laughing at a world he considers a joke worth destroying. The Patrick Bateman reciting a business card's font like scripture, moments before he stops pretending to be anyone at all. If we aim at entertainment, that image could indeed be very entertaining. But if we want to come down to reality, wanting to see psychopathy in raw, mundane, everyday life, we would have to redefine it with an equal sense of realism. And this time, we do not aim at the thrill, but at understanding, which of course can be a little boring for a part of the audience. The clinical reality of psychopathy is that it is a very measurable set of traits, the traits we will shortly meet. There is a checklist upon which we measure psychopathy called PCLR, the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. This checklist is a list of traits, and someone is said to be a psychopath if he scores higher than normal on this checklist.
Very, very little depth.
This is Dr. Babiak Hare, the developer of the checklist we just used to measure psychopathy. A researcher in the field of criminal psychology, he has become recognized as the foremost authority on psychopaths over 35 years of research at University of British Columbia. He has devoted most of his academic career to the investigation of psychopathy, its nature, assessment, and implications for mental health and criminal justice. He is the author of several books, including Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths, Among Us, and more than 100 scientific articles on psychopathy. For those interested in further readings, the link to his book lies in the description. One important aspect to the checklist is that there is no one red line, which only upon crossing could declare you a psychopath. There is only a spectrum. and some psychopaths are more psychopathic than others based on the heights of their scores. A person who meets 10 of the criteria is still considered a psychopath, but to a lesser degree on the spectrum than someone who meets 12, for instance. Psychopathy, in other words, is measured in degrees. So, dear viewer, let this chapter end where it should. Upon understanding that psychopaths are not descended from devils, but primates, just like us, they too are Homo sapiens. And just like any other personality disorder ever named, psychopathy is about a very measurable set of traits. Most people, when they think of the psychopath, think of blood, crime, and a cold of expression in face and body that reads as inhuman. This is very natural. A simple consequence of entertaining the popular image of the psychopath is that it leads us to believe that psychopaths are always behind the bars, imprisoned for their crimes, or in the hospital, hospitalized for their madness. The truth, however, is by far more complex. Psychopaths are not confined to prisons and hospitals. A very good number of psychopaths is somewhere else, somewhere you and I should have been, where we could have been had we been like them. There is a very large body of research on psychopathy inside prisons. There is almost none inside offices, not because psychopathy stops at the office door, but because no company wants researchers combing through its executives. In 2010, however, Paul Babiak and Robert Hare got past that wall when they were given a rare opportunity to study psychopathy in corporate offices. What they found on the other side of it would not leave the field quiet for long. 203 corporate professionals took part, people their own companies had chosen and were grooming for leadership. Babiak and Hare measured them on the same clinical scale used in prisons. Then they did something no prison study could ever do. They laid the scores next to real performance reviews, the ratings these people's own bosses, peers, and subordinates had already given them at work. The number that came back was 4%. 4 in every 100 participants scored high enough to meet the clinical threshold for psychopathy, roughly 4 times the rate found in the general population, which is only 1%. But the real finding wasn't the number. It was what the traits were doing. The same people who scored high on psychopathy were also rated by their colleagues as more charismatic, more creative, sharper strategic thinkers, and, in the same breath, rated worse at actually performing the job, worse as team players, worse at the basic work of managing people. Media has always had a gift for distortion, and the public, with no closer exposure to the truth than the media headlines and popular crime shows, tends to believe whatever version arrives first. This, dear viewer, results in considerable misinformation and misunderstanding. Something similar happened to this study as well. That 4% didn't stay 4% for long. Somewhere between the study and the headlines, it grew into a claim that 10% of Wall Street were psychopaths. It was a better story, but it was not what the study said. Then, eventually, in 2012, Babiak and Hare corrected the record themselves. Their sample was never meant to represent all of corporate America, and the number was never 10. They later wrote all of this into a book, Snakes in Suits, When Psychopaths Go to Work. If you want the full account, the case files, the detail this chapter doesn't have room for, it's linked below. In 1941, nearly 70 years before Babiak and Hare walked into that boardroom, Cleckley had already sketched a psychopathic businessman in his case files, a man who worked hard, appeared entirely normal, and showed nothing unusual except for a pattern of quiet cruelty and risk no one seemed to adopt. Cleckley knew from the very beginning that this thing didn't only live behind bars, but the decades that followed studied psychopathy almost exclusively in prisons, and the public image narrowed with it, fed by films and headlines until the businessman in the case file was forgotten and only the killer remained. It took until the 2000s for the field to remember what it already knew in 1941. Hold these both ideas before you, dear viewer. Power does not merely tolerate certain traits of psychopathy, at times it appears to reward them, and the very traits that disturb us in one setting can be admired in another. What remains is the only question this chapter has not yet earned the right to answer. Why? Let me introduce you to a genuinely fascinating paradox. The qualities we punish and humiliate people for in a courtroom are the very qualities we seek out and reward in a boardroom. Oftentimes, we promote these traits unintentionally in our surroundings. We confuse confidence for capability, fearlessness for steadiness, and remorselessness for decisiveness, for instance. And thus, by indirectly requiring them, we promote them. Certain professions, particularly furthermore, need and encourage these traits and tendencies in people. In 2020, researchers at Stanford ran a simple test. They filmed mock job interviews, then had outside observers rate each candidate for competence. The candidates who came across as more confident were rated as smarter and more capable, with no actual evidence behind it. Confidence looked like competence, and nobody in the room could tell the difference. No interviewer sets out to hire a psychopath. But an interview rewards certainty, and certainty is one of the easiest things in the world for someone who feels no doubt to fake, or, in some cases, doesn't need to fake at all. In the heart of charisma lies attention and thus power. Long before there were cameras or social platforms, there were crowds. And the crowds would never reward the timid and the hesitant. It would only reward whoever would look it in the eye and hold it. Think of the general who addressed his army before the battle, the orator who held a forum, the preacher who filled a square, and you find the same pattern. There are hundreds of ways we unintentionally promote these traits. But at times certain particular professions need and actively encourage these traits and tendencies. That is how a single quality becomes a blade with two edges. Perhaps this is not a flaw in how the world chooses its leaders. Perhaps it is closer to a law. Every age has needed someone willing to do what the rest of us cannot bring ourselves to do, to cut into the body, to send men to die, to decide a fate and live with having decided it. History does not remember the hand that trembled, it remembers the hand that didn't. And so, generation after generation, without ever naming what it was doing, the world has quietly gone looking for the same kind of person. Not the kindest or the wisest, but the one who could act where others would only hesitate. That is not corruption. That may simply be how power has always chosen its own.
And I always said that I was like a minor wizard because he would be casting spells and I would see people mesmerized. But because I'm a minor wizard, the spells don't work on me. I could not cast those spells. But I'd see them and I would say, hey, wait, don't. You're going to work even more than I would ask you to. This is crazy. Or
in the years before the iPhone existed, Apple ran two teams in secret, working against each other on two different designs. One team, led by Tony Fadell, tried to build the phone around the iPod's click wheel, the thing that had already made Apple a fortune. For months, they tried to make it work. It never did. We tried for weeks and weeks and weeks to make that happen, Fadell said later. But it never worked. Jobs killed it anyway. This safe option, the proven one, and staked the entire company on something that had never shipped in a phone before. a screen with no buttons at all, controlled only by a finger. Anyone on the project who disagreed was told to leave it. At the announcement, he stood on a stage and dismissed the alternative in 4 words that are still quoted today.
Who wants a stylus? You have to get them and put them away and you lose them. Yuck. Nobody wants a stylus. So let's not use a stylus.
The gamble worked. It usually does, right up until the day it doesn't. And the people who bet the company on it are really the ones who pay if it fails.
Yes.
In 1983, Jobs wanted to hire away the CEO of Pepsi, a corporate executive twice his age, running a Fortune 500 giant with no obvious reason to leave for a struggling computer company. Jobs made his pitch on a terrace in New York, and it wasn't really a business proposal at all.
A few months ago, when Steve was visiting me in Manhattan, he asked me a very important question. He said, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or come with me and change the world?" Well, here I am. Thank you.
2 years later, that same Scully would help push Jobs out of the company he'd built. But the pitch worked because Jobs never seemed to doubt it was true. He said the same kind of thing about himself for the rest of his life. In a 1985 interview, he described wanting a hand in something that would make a little dent in the universe. As though the universe were something ordinary men simply hadn't gotten around to touching yet. Most people who talk like that are laughed out of the room. Jobs said it, and men who ran the largest companies on earth got up from their desks and followed him. In February 1981, a young engineer named Andy Hertzfeld had just joined the Macintosh team. His new manager, Bud Tribble, told him the software would ship in 10 months. Hertzfeld said that was impossible. Tribble had a name for what he was about to watch happen: the reality distortion field, borrowed from a Star Trek episode where aliens built a new world by force of will alone. In his presence, reality is malleable, Tribble told him. It wasn't quite a compliment. It also wasn't wrong. Deadlines nobody believed in got hit. Products nobody thought were possible got built. Hertzfeld later called it an eagerness to bend any fact to fit the purpose at hand. And the strange part was that knowing about it never seemed to help. Engineers who understood exactly what was happening to them kept walking into it anyway. Steve Wozniak, who built more of Apple's early hardware than anyone alive, put it more simply after decades of watching it up close: "I just wish he had been honest." In 1978, a girlfriend named Chrisanne Brennan gave birth to a daughter. Jobs was 23, already building a company that would make him one of the richest men in the country within 3 years, and he denied in public and in court that the child was his. He signed a legal document swearing he was sterile and infertile. A paternity test later put the odds of him being the father above 94%. Jobs' answer was to point out that some smaller share of the male population could have fathered her too, as though the math outweighed the daughter standing in front of him, named after the very machine he was building. Brennan raised their daughter on welfare, cleaning houses, while Apple's valuation climbed into the hundreds of millions. In 1997, Apple Computer was, by its own later account, 90 days from running out of money. 3 CEOs had come and gone in a decade, unable to stop the bleeding. The company held 4% of a market it had once invented. At a technology conference that year, someone asked Michael Dell, founder of the rival eating Apple alive, what he would do if he were in charge of it. Dell didn't hesitate. "I'd shut it down," he said. and give the money back to the shareholders. The room laughed. It wasn't an unreasonable answer. It was, by every visible number, the correct one. That same year, the company Steve Jobs had built after being pushed out of his own boardroom, a failing venture called Next, was bought back by Apple almost as an afterthought, a way to acquire some software nobody else wanted badly enough to bid for. Jobs came with it. Almost nobody expected him to stay. He stayed, and within weeks, he began cutting. Of the nearly 350 products Apple was making when he walked back through the door, he killed all but 10. Whole divisions closed in a single afternoon. Engineers who had spent years on a project found out it no longer existed in a meeting that sometimes lasted less than a minute. He did not soften this. He did not explain himself twice. What he built afterward, the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the most valuable company that had ever existed, would eventually make Michael Dell publicly eat his own words. But, dear viewer, before any of that, there was simply a man walking through the wreckage of a company he used to run, deciding, alone, whose work still mattered and whose didn't, and mattering from that point on to almost no one but him.